first story, The Watcher in the Woods. It was a foggy morning when I arrived at Holloway Creek, a sleepy little town in the heart of Oregon. I was on my way to visit my cousin, Jackie, who had moved here a few months ago. She had invited me to spend a weekend at her cottage by the woods. I was looking forward to getting away from the hustle of city life, but something about the town seemed off. The locals were distant and kept to themselves, and the trees surrounding the town looked like they were closing in on it. As I walked up the path to Jackie's place, I noticed the quiet. There were no birds chirping, no wind blowing through the branches. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Jackie greeted me with a smile, but there was something in her eyes that didn't seem right. She was pale, her voice low and shaky. When I asked what was wrong, she just told me to stay close and not wander too far from the house. That night, after a simple dinner, Jackie and I sat by the fireplace talking about the past. But I could feel it. The strange tension in the air, the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but as the wind howled outside, I heard something moving in the woods. It was slow, heavy footsteps crunching through the damp earth. I looked at Jackie, who had gone silent, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered, "It's him." "Who is it?" I asked, confused. Jackie's face grew even more pale. "The Watcher," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He lives in the woods. He only comes out at night." I laughed, thinking she was just telling me a scary story. But the fear in her eyes kept me from laughing too loud. I could hear the footsteps again, closer now. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find nothing but the darkness of the night. Just silence. That night, I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence, that feeling of being watched. And then it came, a knock at the window. I jumped out of bed, looking outside into the thick fog. There was nothing there. But then I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing by the trees. Its head was large and round, with long ears like a rabbit, and its eyes, those eyes were watching me. I felt my breath catch in my throat, but I couldn't look away. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I found Jackie outside, sitting on the porch, staring into the woods. When I asked her about it, she simply said, "He only comes when you look." I left Holloway Creek that day, but the images of those eyes haunted me for weeks. To this day, I still hear the footsteps in the woods whenever I find myself alone. And I know one thing for certain: the Watcher is still out there. Second, story: The Whispers of Gray Hollow. It was a foggy night when I first drove into Gray Hollow, a small town in the deep woods of Virginia. It was the kind of place most people only drive through without stopping. I didn't know why I was there. Maybe It was the old story I'd heard from a stranger in the last town I passed. Maybe it was just curiosity or the need for a break from the routine of city life. The town was deserted when I arrived. No lights except for the dim glow of a single street lamp flickering by the old town hall. Parked my car beside a rundown inn, the only place that seemed open. I walked in to find a bored old man behind the counter. He looked up from his newspaper without a word, just gesturing toward the stairs. I took the room key and went up. The room was small, dusty, and had that old smell of forgotten places. Opened the window to let in some fresh air, but all I could see was the dense fog rolling through the streets. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard a soft whisper coming from the woods. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was something unnatural about it, like it was calling my name. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder until they felt like they were right outside my window. I could hear individual words, but they didn't make sense. Come closer. Join us. Don't be afraid. A shiver ran down my spine. Unable to resist, I found myself standing in front of the window. I squinted through the fog, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures moving in the shadows. Then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Someone was at my door. I opened it and found no one there, but the whispers continued, now louder than ever. I followed the sound out of the room, down the stairs, and through the door of the inn. The fog had become thicker, swallowing the streets in its grip. I walked down the old dirt road, guided only by the mysterious whispers. The town seemed to stretch forever. The houses looked abandoned, their windows blank and empty. The whispers pulled me toward the woods, and I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The trees closed in around me, their branches twisting and creaking in the wind. As I moved further into the forest, I felt a presence following me, like someone was watching my every step. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, its face pale, its eyes dark and unblinking. It spoke in a voice that sounded like 1,000 others, all whispering together. "You're too late," it said. "We were waiting for you." Suddenly, the fog seemed to close in around me, the whispers becoming a roar, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. The last thing I remembered was the figure reaching out to touch me. And then darkness. I woke up the next morning alone at the inn. The fog had lifted and the town was silent. No one seemed to remember me or the night before. But I could still hear the whispers in the distance. I left Gray Hollow that day, but I can't shake the feeling that the whispers are still following me, waiting for me to return. Third story: The Hollows of Ravenswood. I was driving through the dense forest of Ravenswood on a foggy morning when I first heard the rumor. Locals had warned me about the forest and its dark secrets. They called it the Hollows, a place where you could lose your way and never return. I didn't believe them at first, figuring it was just another tale to scare tourists away. But the tension in their eyes was hard to ignore. As I drove along the narrow road, the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting and wreathing like the fingers of a long-forgotten hand. The air felt thicker as I ventured deeper into the forest. A feeling of being watched crept over me. The road was barely visible through the fog, and I found myself slowing down, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. I was almost halfway through when I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, still as stone. Its outline was shrouded in mist, but I could make out the hollow eyes staring at me. I slammed on the brakes and came to a screeching halt. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the figure. Then it moved. The figure glided across the road with unnatural speed, its feet barely touching the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It vanished into the trees, leaving only a chill in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to press on. I drove further into the forest, the fog growing thicker around me. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. The engine's hum became a distant whine zivverb of mir, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going, but I was too far in to turn back. Then I saw it again. This time there were more figures, standing at the edges of the road, motionless. Their eyes glowed in the fog, and their faces were twisted in a way I couldn't understand. I slowed down as I approached them, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the darkness, "Leave now, before it takes you." I looked around, but there was no one near. My hands were shaking, and my vision blurred with panic. I knew I had to leave, but I felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. It was then that I realized the truth about the Hollows. It wasn't just a place you could get lost in. It was a place that took people, and once you entered, you could never escape. The figures moved closer. They were silent, but I could hear their breaths, ragged and deep. I tried to start the car, but the engine refused to turn over. I was stuck. The mist was growing thicker now, consuming everything in its path. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see nothing. I looked back toward the figures, but they were gone. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched remained. I managed to start the car, finally, my heart racing as I drove out of the Hollows. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Fourth story, the Whispering Woods. It was a foggy fall night when I found myself on the edge of Everwood Forest, a dense woodland just outside of Claremont, New Hampshire. I had heard the stories growing up about the forest, the disappearances and the strange whispers that echoed through the trees at night. But I never took them seriously, figuring it was just local legend. I was in Claremont for business, staying at a bed and breakfast on the edge of town. One evening, I decided to take a walk through the forest, thinking nothing of the rumors. The air was thick with fog as I stepped onto the damp ground, the trees towering over me like silent giants. I had walked for almost an hour, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the dense fog, when I heard it, a soft whisper just beneath the sound of the wind. It was a voice, too low to understand, but it was there. I paused and looked around, but there was nothing in sight. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost as if it was right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but no one was there. Just the fog and the silent trees. I told myself it was just the wind, the trees making sounds as they swayed. But the whispers grew stronger, more insistent. It was like they were calling my name, Clara. I felt my stomach drop, but I couldn't move. I should have turned back, but something kept me going. The further I walked into the forest, the more the whispers filled the air. They were no longer just soft sounds, but clear words, voices from all around me. Clara. Come closer. I felt my pulse thundering in my ears, but I couldn't stop moving. I was drawn forward, compelled to follow the voices. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every step, the trees closing in around me. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, its shape indistinct in the fog. It was a person, I thought, but as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't human. It had no face, just a dark silhouette against the fog. Come to me, the figure whispered, its voice gravely and low. I couldn't move, even if I wanted to. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked onto the figure. I could feel something cold brush against my skin, like the chill of death itself. Then I heard a sound behind me, a rustling in the leaves. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the silence of the forest. And yet the whispers continued. They were growing louder, rising in intensity. Clara, Clara, help us. Suddenly, the figure lunged towards me, its arms outstretched, its mouth opening wide, a gaping black hole in its face. I screamed and turned to run, but the forest seemed to warp around me, the trees shifting and closing off my path. I ran blindly, the whispers growing louder until they were the only thing I could hear. I could feel the cold breath of the figure on my neck. I could feel its presence closing in. And then everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The fog lifted. And I found myself standing at the edge of the forest, the town of Claremont in front of me. But something was different. The town looked older, darker. The buildings were decaying, the streets empty, and as I stood there in the gathering darkness, I heard the whispers again. Clara, welcome home. First for whispering woods. It was a foggy fall morning when I decided to explore the forest outside Greendale, a quiet village in New York. The town was small and peaceful, but there was always something about the woods that felt wrong. People talked about the forest in hushed tones, whispering of disappearances and strange sights after dark. But I was curious and wanted to see it for myself. I had grown up hearing the stories from the townsfolk, but I never took them seriously. That morning, I felt the urge to venture into the heart of the woods. It was said that if you walked deep enough into the forest, you'd hear strange whispers that came from nowhere. I entered the woods through an old trail, the ground soft beneath my feet, the trees towering above me like silent guardians. The air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves, and the fog clung to the trees, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. As I ventured further in, the sound of my footsteps was absorbed by the dense foliage. It was eerily quiet. No birds chirped, no wind whistled through the branches. Just silence. Then it came the first whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But the words were clear. Turn back. I paused and looked around. The forest seemed unchanged, nothing unusual about the place. Yet the whispers grew louder. Turn back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The whispers weren't the wind. They were voices, and they were coming closer. I kept walking, despite the growing unease. I had come this far, I wasn't about to turn back now. As I walked deeper, the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting and reaching like hands grasping for me. I could hear the whispers, now more distinct, and they weren't just words, they were names. Sarah, Michael, Emily. My name was called next, James. I stopped dead in my tracks. Who was calling me? It felt like the forest itself was alive, breathing with a darkness I could not understand. The whispers turned into soft laughter. I started to run. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just wanted to get out. But the further I ran, the faster the laughter followed. The whispers grew louder until they were screaming in my ears. I stumbled and fell onto the ground. When I looked up, I saw the shadows of figures moving between the trees. They were tall and slender, their faces hidden in the fog. The forest seemed to close around me, a wall of darkness. I could hear footsteps approaching from behind. I turned and found myself face to face with a woman. She was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth hung open, as if she was about to speak, but no sound came out. Then the whispers stopped. A deep silence fell over the forest. I was trapped. Suddenly, the woman leaned forward, her mouth coming closer to my ear. Welcome home. The forest shuddered, and the trees began to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows closed in. I was never seen again. And from that day on, the whispers in the woods grew louder. Sixth story, The Whispering Trees. It was a dark night when I drove through the small town of Harrison, Michigan. I'd never been there before, but the promise of an adventure lured me in. The locals were friendly enough, but there was a strange tension in the air. They warned me about the forest just outside of town that was said to be haunted. Of course, I didn't believe them. I was just looking for something to shake up my life. The forest was only a few miles away from town, but The moment I entered it, I felt an unsettling quiet. Not a single bird chirped. Not a single leaf rustled. Just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. I could feel the trees watching me, their twisted branches reaching down like long fingers. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered. As I walked deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier. A whispering sound began to fill the air, like the trees themselves were talking. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears to catch the words, but there was nothing. Nothing except the creeping feeling that something was close. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, almost inaudible. But as I stepped closer to the source, it became louder. Leave this place. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the trees and the darkness. I started to back away, but the whispers grew louder. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. Leave this place. They chanted. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep moving. Had to get out. But no matter how fast I walked, the whispers kept pace. Every step I took, they came closer. And then I heard something even worse. A snap, like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. I spun around. The forest was empty. But the whispers continued. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and dark, standing between the trees. It didn't move. It just watched. I took off running. My breath was sharp, my legs burning. But no matter how fast I ran, the figure was always there, just behind me, its whispers echoing in my ears. I finally made it back to the forest. But as I looked back, I could still hear the whispers, still see the figure, standing in the shadows. I never went back to Harrison. I never told anyone what happened that night. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, I can still hear those whispers, calling me back. 7th Storyverse of Wildwood. It was late fall when I decided to take a weekend trip to Wildwood, a small town in Maine, known for its dense forest and long-forgotten tales of lost travelers. I had heard whispers of the woods from locals, but I never took them seriously. People spoke about shadows moving on their own, of eyes watching from the trees, but it was just that, whispers. I didn't believe in such things. I arrived in Wildwood just as the sun began to set. The air was cool, and the trees were bare, their gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like skeletal hands. I checked into a small inn on the edge of town. The owner, a stooped elderly man, greeted me with a slight nod. But there was something off about his gaze. It was like he knew something I didn't. That night, as I lay in my room, the wind howled outside, a strange sound echoing through the forest beyond. Could sworn I heard voices, whispers, carried on the wind, but I brushed it off as just my imagination. After all, it was a forest town. It was only natural for the wind to make strange noises. I decided to explore the forest this next morning. The trees were taller than I had expected, and the air was thick with moisture. The ground was mossy and soft underfoot, and the further I walked in, the more isolated the area felt. It was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. As I ventured deeper, I came across a clearing with a stone circle at its center. The stones were covered in lichens and moss, but there was something odd about the arrangement. It felt deliberate, but I couldn't tell why. I knelt down to inspect them, and that's when I heard the whispering again. This time it was clearer. It was a soft voice calling my name, a faint but persistent sound coming from the trees. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, looking around nervously. "Who's there?" I called, but there was no response. The whispers ceased for a moment, but then they came back, closer this time, as if someone was right behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The forest seemed empty, and yet I felt like I wasn't alone. I stepped backwards, fighting the urge to run, and that's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and shadowy. Its features were indistinct, but there was a sense of wrongness to its presence, like it didn't belong there. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural cold. I could feel its gaze upon me, its eyes piercing through the darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, frozen in place. The figure didn't approach, but the whispers grew louder, as if the forest itself was speaking to me. A dread filled my chest, and I knew I had to leave. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead, and the whispers seemed to follow me, growing fainter but more insistent with every step. By the time I made it back to the edge of the woods, the sun was setting again. I could still hear the whispers, but they were distant now, fading into the night. I rushed back to the inn, heart pounding in my chest, but the elderly owner was nowhere to be found. The next morning, I left Wildwood without looking back. I never spoke to anyone about what happened that night, but I could never shake the feeling that the whispers had followed me home. Every night since, I hear them in the wind, soft and persistent, calling my name from the trees. 8th story, The Whispers of Hollow Creek. It was late October when I arrived at Hollow Creek, a tiny town in the foothills of Tennessee, its streets silent and narrow, drowned in the mist that rolled off the mountains every morning. I had heard the rumors about the woods nearby, that how no one who entered them ever came back the same, if they came back at all. But I was no believer in such things. Still, when I stepped off the bus and looked down the deserted main street, a cold chill settled in my bones. The air was thick with the smell of pine and decay, and the trees that lined the road seemed to whisper to one another. I figured it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder, almost like they were calling me. I made my way to the local inn, an old wooden building that looked like it had seen better days. Inside, I was greeted by an old man, his wrinkled face etched with stories of times long past. "You might not want to stay here too long," he warned in a hoarse voice, his eyes darting nervously towards the door. "Not many come back after dark." I ignored him, tired from my long journey, and retired to my room. That night, as I lay in bed, that I could hear the soft rustling of the trees outside my window, but it wasn't just the wind. The whispers had returned, closer this time, their voices low and urgent. I pulled the blankets over my head, but the whispers grew louder, until it was as if the trees themselves were speaking to me. The sound was so clear, I could almost make out the words, "Come to us." I fought the urge to leave the room, but something compelled me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the only light came from the soft glow of my flashlight. The whispers were now louder, closer, like they were right behind me. I walked down the narrow road, following the sound of the whispers, until I reached the edge of the forest. I hesitated, but the whispers urged me forward. I stepped into the darkness, the trees closing in around me. The whispers became more intense, filling my mind with visions of strange figures, half seen in the dark. I saw shadows move between the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then I heard a soft voice call my name. I turned and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice faint and broken. "You will never leave this place." Suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone. The trees were alive, their branches reaching out towards me. I tried to run, but the ground beneath my feet began to shift, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow me. The last thing I heard was the whispers, growing louder, as I fell into the darkness. When they found me the next morning, I was lying at the edge of the forest. But I wasn't the same. The whispers had followed me, and now I hear them even in the light of day. Ninth story, The Whispers of Evergreen Forest. It was a foggy evening when I drove into Evergreen Hollow, a small town hidden in the woods of North Carolina, where the trees seem to reach towards the sky and the air always smells of pine. I had been told stories about this place, and tales of people who entered the forest and never came back. But I was skeptical of such things. I didn't believe in curses or spirits, at least not until I heard the whispers. I had arrived to spend the night with a friend named Jacob. He was a local and insisted that I should see the forest for myself. "There's something special about this place," he told me as we walked down the quiet street. I could tell he was nervous, but I assumed it was just the small town tension. We drove down a narrow dirt road that led to the forest. It was dark by the time we arrived, the moon shining through the branches like a dim light in a cave. Jacob warned me, not to stray too far from the path. "You won't like what you find," he said. As we walked deeper into the woods, I noticed that the air felt heavier with each step. The trees were taller. Here, behind that, their trunks twisted and gnarled as if they had been watching for centuries. I could almost hear the whispers of the wind, or so I thought. Jacob suddenly stopped and motioned for me to be quiet. "Listen," he whispered. I paused and focused on the sound of the wind. But there was something else. Soft murmur, a low humming sound coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard my name. A low and urgent whisper. "James?" The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I turned to Jacob, who looked pale as a ghost. "You hear it too?" he asked, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just a murmur, but a cacophony, voices echoing through the forest. Some were familiar, others were unintelligible, but all of them were calling us. Jacob started walking faster, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave now." But I couldn't move. The whispers had frozen me in place. I felt as if the forest itself was alive, and it wanted me. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a shadow among the trees, its outline blurred by the mist. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to bend in ways that should not be possible. Jacob screamed and ran towards the path. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Its head tilted towards me, and its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed bright blue. "James." The voice whispered again, this time closer. It wasn't Jacob. It wasn't anyone I knew. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers increased, echoing inside my mind. I could hear the trees groaning, shifting as if they were alive. And then it was gone. The whispers, the figure, the night, everything vanished in an instant. I was standing in the middle of the forest, alone. Jacob was gone. I never found him. And the town denies anything happened. But the whispers still follow me. I can hear them whenever I sleep. And every time I close my eyes, I see the glowing blue eyes watching me. 10th story, Whispers in Ravenwood. It was late October when I arrived in Ravenwood, a sleepy town nestled in the mountains of North Carolina. I had never heard of it before until my old friend, Sarah, had sent me a message out of the blue. "You have to see this place before it disappears," she had written. I thought she was being dramatic, but curiosity got the best of me, so I packed my things and drove up the winding mountain road. The town was quiet, too quiet. The air was chilly, the kind of cold that stayed deep in your bones. As I walked down the main street, there was no sound of cars or people. It was as if the town was frozen in time. I made my way to the old motel Sarah had recommended. It was a small building with a neon sign that flickered weakly. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit and smelled of mold and dust. The clerk, a man with gray hair and a sluggish smile gave me a key without saying much. When I reached my room, I noticed something odd. The window was partially open. I was sure I had closed it when I entered, but I didn't think much of it. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the soft sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But as the whispers grew louder, I realized they were coming from outside the window. I got up and peered out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the trees in the distance moved in the wind. But there was nothing there. I closed the window and tried to sleep, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all around me, a low, hissing sound. It was as if the forest itself was speaking. The next morning, I decided to explore the town. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, as if it were alive, watching. As I walked toward the edge of the town, I saw a large oak tree standing by the road. It was old, with gnarled roots that seemed to reach out toward me. A man in a worn coat was standing beneath the tree. He looked at me with a haunted expression, his eyes dark with fear. "Don't go into the forest," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's not what you think." I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and walked away. Confused, I decided to head back to the motel. That night, the whispers returned, but this time, they weren't from the outside. They were inside the room. I could hear them clearly now. Soft and sibilant, they spoke in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up, frozen in fear. Suddenly, the door to my room creaked open. A shadow moved across the floor, too slow, too deliberate. I could feel its presence as it hovered near me. Then, the whispers stopped. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness. The next morning, I left Ravenwood, never to return. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. From the trees, from the shadows. And I wondered, what did the man mean when he warned me about the forest? As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing beneath the oak tree. I never looked back.